Releasing in Australian cinemas in March is the latest exhibition on screen film from Seventh Art Productions, which is Turner and Constable. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the producer and co-writer of Turner and Constable, Phil Grabsky. Phil, always great to talk to you. Welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Fantastic. You too.
Now, again, this is such a fascinating documentary about two landscape artists, and uh, both of them being exhibited at the Tate Gallery. So, is that how it all came about that you were able to make this film?
So there's no question that these are two of the greatest British artists. And we've been looking at the possibility of making a film about them individually for some time. I talked to the Tates a few years ago. For a couple of years, I was talking to them about doing an exhibition just about Turner. Obviously, Tate has an enormous collection of Turner's works because they were bequeathed to the Tate. Constable, we were also interested in, and I've made a television film about him in the past. Little concerned about his international appeal. So while these things were going around our heads, and obviously we've plenty of other productions going on too, then we went and had our regular meeting with the Tate and asked them what their future productions were going to be. And when they said they were doing this huge exhibition of both the artists, it was perfect because not only were we going to be able to explore their individual biographies, but we could see them in relation to one another, their rivalry to some extent, but also it's more complex than that. They learned from each other, they joshed with one another. They are the two finest landscape artists that Britain has ever produced. It was fantastic to see these paintings up close and personal, but also to see them in relation to one another. And just finally, as part of this introduction, one thing that has come through from the reviews of the exhibition and from, anecdotally, just talking to people, is that people knew of Turner as this kind of revolutionary artist. And Constable, for some, had been rather relegated to a kind of a bit chocolate boxy, a little bit conservative, stuck in his ways in Suffolk. When you see the exhibition and when you see the film, you realize that actually he is also a revolutionary artist. And we'll talk in a minute, but I mean, his influence on 19th century art was profound in a way that people don't realize. So we're delighted to have made this film, and the previews of in the United Kingdom have all gone very, very well.
Well, it is an excellent documentary, as always, that you produce about artists, and I found this one so interesting because of their backgrounds and of the poetry that you use, and so on. That Robert Lindsay so cleverly
Yeah.
narrates in the film. So putting that together, I thought was really quite impressive.
Well, it helps that I have a very creative Australian colleague, David Bickerstaff, who you know well,
Yes.
who, he directed Van Gogh, Poets and Lovers and plenty of other films. And he came to me and he said, I'd like to use this poetry. The reason the poetry is so important is that we are, as you know, Peter, we are making cinema films.
Mm.
And I want people to know when they come that it's going to be a cinematic experience. We're not trying to just kind of bring a television program to a bigger screen. There's an aesthetic to our films. Now, when we make these kind of slightly purer exhibition on screen films where we are really locating ourselves within a specific exhibition, for those who can't get to see it, and indeed for those who do, but in Australia, let's assume that 99% of our audience won't get to see the actual exhibition. When we're making those kind of pure films, to have something like this very apt and appropriate poetry. Just even if you're not really following the poetry, you're getting a sense of that this is slightly more poetic as a film, slightly more cinematic. Robert Lindsay, I mean, I've seen him on stage. He's extraordinary. We've used him twice before. He narrated our Rembrandt film, and more recently, he did the kind of more prosaic narration in Vermeer, the greatest exhibition. And it's a great honor for me that he has that poster up in his house. Can you imagine this man who's been in so many musicals and theatrical productions? He's got a poster of Vermeer, the greatest exhibition, up in his house. So we approached him and he was free. And, you know, it's fantastic to have his delivery. And I think it really does help. I think you know, that was contemporaneous, the poetry. It's not work that I personally knew before. David did, I didn't. Um, you know, we can forget. You know, sometimes. I mean, obviously Victorian. Well, it's not even Victorian England, but you know, 18th, 19th century Britain was industrializing. You know, you can get lost in the images of the mills and the smoke and the trains and the this, that, and the other. It actually was also an enormously creative time, and you know, the poets were brilliant and prolific. So it was a very nice addition to the film. I'm glad you pointed it out.
Yes, it really is superb. Now, let's talk about the choice of the paintings and the curators who speak about those paintings, because that is so they're so erudite about explaining Turner and Constable and their influence on Impressionism.
Well, first thing to say is that we are not an offshoot of a gallery. We're not funded by the galleries, and the galleries have no editorial control. So we don't set out to make a kind of hagiography. If we feel that criticism is justified, we will make that criticism. And if I have a criticism of this exhibition, is that it's enormous. And it's very hard actually to absorb everything. There are so many paintings. If I remember correctly, something like 185 artworks. So Amy, the curator, and all the team at the Tate did a remarkable job. But you know, it's a lot to absorb. So in a way, the film has an advantage in that we can make a selection, and we can also, to some extent, clarify the chronology a little bit. I understand why Amy organized this show in the way that she did, but it's not a chronological show. It kind of is, but it kind of isn't. There are some rooms you go into which are looking at a specific theme. So we've imposed a slightly more clear chronology to it, which I think helps the audience. And again, it's all part of storytelling. I certainly always will encourage people to go to galleries, to go to exhibitions, see paintings face to face. But for us, David and I, you know, we spent a lot of time thinking, well, which paintings are we going to focus on? What story, what stories are they allowing us to tell? Generally, overall, what we're trying to do is bring you a fresh, revealing biography of these two artists and show you what they were doing, why they were doing it, what the impact was. So clearly, we don't show everything, but we do show a lot. Mm. And we show it to you in high definition, and we show you all the close-ups. I think what's so interesting, I mean, there's so much. I mean, I learned an awful lot. I learned about how really at the forefront of artistic development Constable was. I learned about the difference between them. Turner embraced change. He was excited by the railways and the steam, you know, the replacement of the wooden ships with the steam ships and so on and so forth. Constable, and of course Turner is born in the heart of Soho in London, and you know he has a different background to Constable. Constable's born to, you know, more middle class, if you like, background from Suffolk, which is on the east coast of England, and it's comfortable, agricultural area, but his father ran a mill and was, pretty well off. And he loved that area. He was very happy just painting the mill ponds and the rivers and in some ways he was more conservative. He was nervous about change, but yet his painting was the way he painted was radical. But what's also interesting is that I've fallen into the trap a little bit myself of talking about the French Impressionists being the first to get out into the en plein air, out in the open, because they had their painting. Finally they had paint in tubes like toothpaste.
Mm.
Before that, you had to grind the pigments with oil, and that meant you basically stayed in the studio. Well, actually, what you learn from this film, and you will see them, is artists could go out. Turner and Constable did go out. They had their paint in little pig bladders, which are about the size of I don't know, a big tomato. And they had a little pin in them, and they could go out and they could squeeze, they take the pin out, squeeze the paint out onto the palette. So they were painting outside. Um, I learned, for example, that I'd always thought that Turner's great influence on the French Impressionists came in 1870, when there was a war going on between France and Prussia, Franco-Prussian War. And some artists, like Monet, like Pissarro, like the incredibly important dealer Paul Durand-Ruel, came to London to get away from the war, where they saw Turner for the first time. It was hugely influential. They went back to France after the war and said, we've just seen this remarkable artist and these remarkable paintings, and it affected how they painted. You can see the link between a Turner's painting and a Monet's painting. But actually what I learned was that in 1821, 50 years earlier, Constable paints the Haywain. Now, Constable never travels. He never goes to Europe, unlike Turner. 1821, he paints the Haywain. It's shown at the Salon, I believe in 1825, in Paris, the big summer show, the world's most important show of the year, where it wins a gold medal. And French artists come and look at it and go, oh my God, what is this? Who is this man? And it's so influential on the French Romantic painting, which itself then leads to the French Impressionists. So there's a lot to learn in these from the artists, and also just looking at their paintings is hugely emotional, hugely powerful. They are, I mean, there's a justification for why they are the two greatest landscape artists that we've ever produced, because they are just so great.
Yes, very impressive paintings, and it was great to see them, especially in close up on the big screen. That looks fantastic. And also, it's as always, you use contemporary footage of the environment of the places that they were painting in, etc., to show us what the landscape was really like, and that comparison is so fascinating.
I always really it's one of the things I enjoy the most personally as a filmmaker, when I can, for example, my wife and I went off to the Lake District, so northern England, northwest England. We have this beautiful area called the Lakes, for those of your audience that don't know. And both Turner and Constable went there. And in particular, I went looking for the exact spot that Turner put his easel down to paint a particular painting. And it's such fun to do. And my wife's carrying the tripod, and I've got the camera, and we're scrambling. And of course, there's been tree growth, and there's changes in and of course, the artists don't make it easy because they change things. They move things, they move hills around to make them work better in their composition. She's like, well, I don't, how have they done this? Anyway, it always fascinates me to see the reality, at least a contemporary version of it, and how they painted it. I went to Salisbury. Now, Salisbury Cathedral is one of the most remarkable buildings in this country. And, to go and see it and then see how Constable represents that in paint is fascinating. As an aside, I couldn't get into Salisbury Cathedral that particular day because our Princess Anne was attending an event there, basically, in my opinion, because Donald Trump was in town at Windsor Castle, and I think she found that in her diary there was something happening in Salisbury that was more to her liking, allegedly. So I couldn't actually go inside the cathedral that day. But I mean, there is a real difference between the two of them. But Turner, when the Napoleonic War is happening, Turner couldn't travel. He couldn't go to Europe. But as soon as the war finished, he was off and he was going to Italy and he was traveling as much as he possibly could. Constable never wanted to cross the Channel. He was very happy. But people misunderstand him if they think he only painted Eastern England. He did travel around Britain, I mean, I'm sitting in Brighton, uh, where I live and work, and both artists came here. And in fact, Constable lived here for 4 years because his wife was ill and they thought the sea air would help. And there are some paintings in the film of Brighton, which are very moving to me because I can see which buildings are still here and which buildings have gone. And the other thing that you mentioned was about the Amy and about the interviewees. It's so important who you ask to talk. And David and I spend quite a lot of time casting, if you like, the interviewees. And we really struck lucky again. Amy is a fantastic curator and very articulate. Nicola Morby, we had, obviously David and I do a lot of reading around the subject. Her book, recently released, called Turner and Constable, is exemplary. Lachlan Goody, we've worked with before. He's he's a fantastic artist. He's a brilliant TV presenter in his own right. And in a proper broadcasting environment, he'd be working all the time. Unfortunately, broadcasters have lost their confidence in arts films, which is a shame on the one hand, but means more people are going to the cinema to see our films. He's so articulate, and David, director, who I mentioned before, because he started life as an artist, he always wants to have an artist's perspective in a film, as we did in Van Gogh. And so to see Lachlan out on Hampstead Heath painting watercolors as these two artists would have done, particularly Turner, was really instructive. And then we had a very good history of art, historian who brought real insight into the period. So they really add a lot of depth and a lot of color and a lot of anecdotes. And again, they're just great storytellers too.
Yes. Oh, fascinating. Really interesting to hear them. I'm fascinated by the Royal Academy that Turner and Constable were members of, and of the criticisms
Yeah.
and so on that they engendered. I really found that a really interesting part of the documentary.
One of the things I really like about exhibition on screen is how, obviously, when you've made 41 feature films, there's so many interrelationships between the films. So recently we made My National Gallery, which I thought was a really tremendous film where the majority of, it was 21 people, I think, who told you their favorite painting in the National Gallery in London and why. And most of them were staff. But it also coincided with the 200th anniversary of the National Gallery. And within that history, you learned about the Royal Academy, the importance of the Royal Academy, and then we had the birth of the Tate and the birth of the National Gallery and all these kind of institutions. So the Royal Academy had only really started a little bit before Turner and Constable reach adulthood, but it was the preeminent place that you wanted to be accepted into as an artist. Turner is accepted. He's barely out of his teens. It's amazing. It's you can imagine in that kind of environment, that kind of world, that society, you've got the son of a barber with a kind of probably with a pretty broad London accent being accepted into the Royal Academy because they just saw the talent. Constable, he's still a young man when he's accepted, or initially accepted, but he's still into his 20s. And then to become the full academician, it took Constable a while. And of course, Turner, who's a bit of a rival, obviously, Turner's sitting on these committees, and Constable may or may not know how the votes went, but he must have been getting frustrated. I know how that feels. Before I won the BAFTA, there were 3 times when my final jury, where out of 9 films, they're voting for 4 that are going to be nominated and 1 that wins the award. And 3 times I didn't get nominated. And you're thinking, who are the jurors and who voted? There was one film that was funny, first film I made in Afghanistan, where I met in subsequent years 3 jurors who told me that they voted for me, which didn't make sense at all, because if 3 jurors, at very least, that would have meant a nomination. So somebody was fibbing. Anyway, the point being, you can kind of relate to why Constable was so frustrated, because he knew how talented he was. Anyway, so this whole thing about becoming a Royal Commission, RA after your name, was very important. And then, as the film talks about, they would meet, they would look at each other's paintings, they would comment upon each other's paintings, they would help each other, they would hinder one another. They were rivals, but they were, ultimately, and we've talked about this before, Peter, the key to understanding artists is that they're not after fame and fortune as a primary motivating force. They want to be the best they can be. So Turner would look really carefully at what Constable was doing, and Constable would look really carefully at what Turner was doing, and they might keep it to themselves, but they would learn from one another. So the idea that they were these desperate rivals that were always, fighting one another, that was just a myth created by newspapers and others. There was a little bit of that, but that is not the whole story at all. What they were doing was they were pushing one another. And there's some great stories in the film about how they bounce off one another, things that work, things that didn't work. Ultimately, what they were keen on was almost their legacy. They would have been pleased that, and I'm not the first and I won't be the last, but they would have been pleased that I've made this, produced this film. You have found the time to talk to me about it. I mean, that's what they wanted, people to respect them, and respect them when they were alive, and respect them after they were dead.
Exactly. Yeah. And certainly we want the audience to see this film in Australia. We'll come back to that in a moment. I must also commend the music, as always, by Asa Bennett, who always contributes such great music score for your films.
I've just noticed, actually, Peter, I'm going to interrupt slightly. I've got 1% battery. I don't know why it's dropped from 20 to 1, maybe because it's so cold here. So we might be reaching the end prematurely, but Ace is fantastic. The score is always so important. They never have much time. Bear